January 30th, 2026, 1,200 Canadian auto workers lost their jobs when General Motors shut down the third shift at its Oshawa, Ontario plant. But here's what didn't make the American headlines. On that same day, Canada's industry minister stood in front of cameras and said the words, no American CEO expected to hear. We want our money back. Not a request, not a negotiation, a demand. And she wasn't talking about a few $1,000s in parking fines or administrative fees. She was talking about hundreds of millions of taxpayer dollars that the Canadian government had poured into General Motors facilities under the assumption that GM would honor its commitments to Canadian workers. This isn't a strike. This isn't a protest. This is the beginning of the end of Canada as America's branch plant economy. And General Motors just became the first casualty of a strategy that Washington never saw coming. What if I told you that while American automakers are abandoning Canada to chase Donald Trump's tariff exemptions, Japanese manufacturers are not only staying, they're expanding? And what if the key to understanding Canada's economic future isn't in Washington or Beijing, but in the quiet boardrooms of Toyota and Honda? Let me tell you what happened when Canada stopped asking for permission and started demanding respect. The betrayal didn't start on January 30th. It started decades ago when Canada made a Faustian bargain. We would be the low-cost, reliable manufacturing hub for American corporations. In exchange, they would provide jobs, stability, and access to the massive U.S. market. For a generation, this deal worked. Sort of. The Auto Act signed in 1965 created an integrated North American automotive market. Parts and vehicles flowed freely across the border. Detroit invested billions in Ontario. Cities like Oshawa, Windsor, and Ingersoll became synonymous with automotive manufacturing. Families built multi-generational careers on the assembly line. But here's what they don't tell you in the economics textbooks. Dependency is not partnership. And when the terms change, the dependent party has no leverage. Let me show you the numbers because numbers don't lie even when politicians do. In 2016, the Detroit three automakers, General Motors, Ford, and Stellantis, accounted for 56% of all vehicles produced in Canada. By 2025, that number had collapsed to 23%. That's not a decline. That's a structural abandonment. Meanwhile, auto assembly employment fell from 32,700 in 2015 to 23,700 in 2024. And that's before the tariff-related cuts of 2025 and 2026. Let's focus on General Motors specifically because they are the poster child for corporate treachery wrapped in the language of economic necessity. On May 10, 2025, GM announced it would be eliminating the third shift at the Oshawa assembly plant. The company cited forecasted demand and the evolving trade environment as the reason. Let me translate that corporate speak for you. Donald Trump threatened tariffs on Canadian-made vehicles, and GM immediately decided that protecting its access to the American market was more important than protecting Canadian jobs. The third shift employed approximately 500 direct GM workers. But the ripple effect hit far harder. When you shut down an automotive assembly shift, you don't just cut the workers bolting cars together. You cut the suppliers who make the seats, the windshields, the wiring harnesses. You cut the truckers who haul the parts. You cut the logistics coordinators, the quality inspectors, the maintenance crews, the total damage. According to Unifor, the union representing these workers, up to 1,200 jobs across the entire supply chain would be lost. The layoffs were initially scheduled for November 2025. They were delayed to January 30th, 2026, allegedly to give workers more time and the government a chance to negotiate a trade deal with Washington that might save the jobs. That deal never came. Instead, at 6:30 a.m. on January 30th, workers clocked out for the last time and walked into the frigid Ontario winter. Some had worked at GM for over 30 years. Others were young workers who thought they'd finally secured stable middle-class employment. Todd Forbes, a 48-year-old worker who lost his job that day, told CBC News, "It's definitely gut-wrenching. I've lived in this area my whole life." Forbes had been considering moving to Nova Scotia with his wife and their dog because he didn't believe he could find comparable work in Oshawa. Stephen Hyde, 66, worked for GM for 34 years before being laid off. He described feeling an empty feeling in the pit of my stomach. But here's where the betrayal becomes obscene. In the same week that GM was laying off over 1,000 Canadian workers, the company reported over $12 billion in pre-tax earnings for 2025. Not losses, profits. $12 billion. And what did GM do with those profits? Did they invest in retaining their Canadian workforce? Did they honor the commitments they made when accepting Canadian taxpayer subsidies? No. They announced a $6 billion share buyback program and increased dividends to shareholders. Let me repeat that so it sinks in. GM cut 200 Canadian jobs while simultaneously transferring $6 billion to Wall Street investors. This wasn't a company in distress. This was a company making a calculated decision that Canadian workers were expendable. And it gets worse. While GM was shutting down operations in Oshawa, it was ramping up production at its plant in Fort Wayne in Indiana. The Oshawa plant builds the Chevrolet Silverado pickup truck. So does Fort Wayne. GM didn't need to cut production. They just needed to shift it to the American side of the border to avoid Trump's tariffs. GM added 250 temporary workers in Fort Wayne in the months leading up to the Oshawa cuts. Those are Canadian jobs moved south to appease an American president. Lana Payne, national president of Unifor, did not mince words. General Motors has made a clear decision to cave to Donald Trump rather than stand up for its loyal Canadian workforce, making the workers in Oshawa pay for that appeasement with their jobs. But Oshawa wasn't the only blow. In October 2025, GM announced it was shutting down production of its Bright Drop electric delivery vans at the CAMI assembly plant in Ingersoll, Ontario. The company cited slower than expected growth in the commercial EV market. Translation: we overestimated demand, and rather than weather the downturn, we're pulling out of Canada entirely. The Ingersoll plant employed approximately 1,200 workers. Most were indefinitely laid off. The facility, which had been touted as the future of electric vehicle manufacturing in Canada, sits largely idle. Now, here's the part that should make every Canadian taxpayer furious. In 2022, the federal government and the Ontario provincial government each pledged up to $259 million in funding to support upgrades at the Oshawa and Ingersoll plants. That's over $500 million in public money. The funding was explicitly tied to job retention commitments. The government wasn't just handing out corporate welfare. They were investing in Canadian workers under the promise that GM would maintain roughly 2,600 jobs. GM took the money, then they cut the jobs anyway. On January 30th, 2026, as the Oshawa workers were being laid off, Industry Minister Mélanie Joly appeared on CBC and delivered a message that sent shock waves through the North American automotive industry. So, I had a meeting yesterday with people from GM, and I told them that we would be getting our money back. If GM doesn't want to continue to invest more in Canada, we will invest more in other players. We'll fight for these workers, and we'll find them jobs. This is unprecedented. Governments rarely demand the return of subsidies once they've been dispersed. The administrative burden, the legal complexity, and the political optics of punishing a major employer usually mean that even when companies break their promises, the public money is written off as a sunk cost. But Joly didn't blink. She confirmed the government is seeking to recover millions in funding tied to both the Oshawa and Ingersoll facilities. And she went further. She contrasted GM's behavior with that of other automakers operating in Canada, specifically naming Toyota and Honda as companies that have maintained their commitments even in the face of Trump's tariffs. Let me pause here for a moment because this is a critical question for anyone watching. Do you believe Canada should continue subsidizing foreign corporations that abandon workers the moment it's convenient? Or should there be consequences when companies take taxpayer money and then break their promises? Leave your thoughts in the comments below, because this isn't just about GM. This is about the future of industrial policy in Canada. Now, while General Motors was executing its retreat from Canada, a very different story was unfolding with Japanese automakers. Let's look at the data because the contrast is stark. In 2016, Japanese automakers Honda and Toyota accounted for 44% of vehicle production in Canada. By 2025, that share had grown to 77%. While the Detroit Three were slashing production and closing shifts, the Japanese manufacturers were holding steady and in some cases expanding. Toyota employs approximately 8,500 Canadians across its plants in Cambridge and Woodstock, Ontario. Honda employs about 4,200 at its facility in List, Ontario. And unlike GM, these companies have not announced mass layoffs in response to Trump's tariffs. In fact, Toyota recently launched production of a new version of its best-selling RAV4 compact SUV in Ontario. Honda has paused its Canadian EV supply chain plans, but has explicitly stated it will not reduce its workforce. Brendan Sweeney, managing director of the Trillium Network for Advanced Manufacturing, a think tank based at Western University, explained the difference in a report released in early February 2026. Honda and Toyota are not as worried about quarterly results. They are not as worried about kowtowing to an American president because they are not American companies. They tend to have these long-term horizons for return on investment compared to the US-based automakers. Let me unpack that statement because it's doing a lot of heavy lifting. American corporations, particularly publicly traded ones, operate on quarterly earnings cycles. Every 3 months, They report their financial performance to shareholders. If earnings dip, stock prices fall. If stock prices fall, executives face pressure from boards of directors and activist investors. The result is a relentless focus on short-term profitability, often at the expense of long-term strategic positioning. Japanese corporations, by contrast, operate within a different cultural and financial framework. Shareholders still matter, but the emphasis on quarterly performance is less intense. Companies like Toyota and Honda view their manufacturing plants not as isolated profit centers, but as nodes in a global network. They think in decades, not quarters. This is why when Trump imposed 25% tariffs on the non-US content of Canadian-made cars, Honda and Toyota didn't panic and pull out of Canada. They adjusted their strategies, shifted some production to avoid the worst tariff impacts, but maintained their Canadian footprint. Honda, for example, has committed to maintaining production volumes in Canada, even as it shifts some models to the United States. The company is reportedly exploring new export markets for its Ontario-made vehicles to compensate for reduced U.S. shipments. Toyota has similarly stated that while the Trump tariffs have made manufacturing in Ontario unsustainable for certain models, the company is working on long-term solutions rather than simply abandoning its Canadian operations. There's another factor at play here: the quality of the vehicles being produced. J.D. Power, the global marketing information services company, rates production quality at both the Honda and Toyota plants in Ontario among the world's best. The Honda Civic, which has been manufactured in a list 1988, has been Canada's top-selling car for the past 2 decades. The Toyota RAV4 is one of the best-selling SUVs in North America. These aren't marginal products being dumped into low V-value markets. These are flagship vehicles that command premium prices and generate significant profits. The Japanese automakers have invested in making their Canadian plants centers of excellence, not just low-cost assembly facilities. This is the critical difference. GM views its Canadian plants as cost centers to be optimized or shut down based on quarterly spreadsheets. Toyota and Honda view their Canadian plants as strategic assets that contribute to long-term brand strength and market positioning. And here's the kicker: the Japanese companies are winning. Since 1993, Canada's exports of Japanese brand vehicles have exceeded imports from Japan, the United States, and other countries combined by more than 4.5 million units. Canada isn't just a market for Japanese cars. We're a manufacturing hub that exports high-quality vehicles globally. Now, you might be thinking, okay, so Japanese companies are more loyal. That's nice. But what does that have to do with Mélanie Joly and the revenge narrative? Everything. Because Mélanie Joly isn't just punishing GM. She's systematically building an alternative ecosystem that excludes American automakers who have proven they cannot be trusted. In late November 2025, just 2 months before the Oshawa layoffs, Joly traveled to South Korea and Japan on a 5-day diplomatic and economic mission. The stated purpose was to advance Canada's industrial and economic interests abroad. But the real agenda was far more specific: to deepen partnerships with Asian automakers and defense contractors who are willing to commit to long-term investment in Canada. In Seoul, Joly met with representatives from Hyundai Motor Company and other Korean industrial giants. In Tokyo, she engaged with senior officials from Honda, Toyota, and Mitsubishi. The discussions focused on automotive manufacturing or battery production, aerospace, and defense. This wasn't a goodwill tour. This was Joly sending a message to Washington and Detroit. If you abandon us, we have options, and those options are increasingly attractive. South Korea and Japan are both looking to diversify their manufacturing footprints to reduce dependency on China and to secure stable access to Western markets. Canada, with its stable democracy, skilled workforce, abundant natural resources, and proximity to the U.S., is an ideal partner. Joly explicitly highlighted Canada's world-class industries, highly skilled workforce, and cutting-edge innovation. During the trip, she emphasized the government's commitment to attracting major investments, particularly in the defense sector, which would create jobs and further diversify Canada's international partnerships. When she returned to Canada in early December, Joly held a press conference and made a statement that should have set off alarm bells in Detroit. We are building a more resilient economy by diversifying our industrial partnerships and strengthening our ties with Asia. Canadian workers deserve partners who believe in them for the long term, not just when it's convenient. That last sentence was a direct shot at GM. And then came the payback. On January 30th, 2026, as GM workers were being laid off, Joly didn't just demand the money back. She outlined a new framework for automotive investment in Canada, one that explicitly rewards companies that maintain their commitments and punishes those who don't. The framework, which the government is calling the Industrial Partnership Accountability Act, establishes clear performance metrics for any company receiving federal subsidies for manufacturing. If a company fails to meet employment targets within a specified period, the subsidies must be repaid with interest. Furthermore, Joly announced that future automotive subsidies will be prioritized for companies that meet the following criteria. First, they must commit to maintaining production levels in Canada for a minimum of 10 years. Second, they must agree to use a certain percentage of Canadian-made components in their vehicles. Third, they must invest in workforce training and technology development within Canada, not just assembly line jobs. And fourth, they must agree to allow the federal government to audit their compliance annually. This is a dramatic shift. For decades, Canadian governments have essentially handed out subsidies with minimal strings attached, hoping that goodwill and market forces would keep companies invested. That era is over. But the most aggressive element of Joly's strategy is what's being called the Poor Red State campaign. Here's how it works. Trump's tariffs were designed to force automotive production back into the United States, particularly into states that voted for him. Indiana, Ohio, Michigan. These are the battlegrounds of American electoral politics, and Trump wants to deliver manufacturing jobs to them. But Canada has a weapon Trump didn't anticipate: retaliatory tariffs that are surgically targeted at politically sensitive American exports. In 2025, Canada imposed tariffs on Kentucky bourbon, Florida orange juice, and agricultural products from key swing states. These weren't random choices. They were designed to create political pressure on Trump by hurting the economic interests of his voters and donors. Joly is now expanding this strategy specifically around automotive components. Canada is the largest foreign supplier of automotive parts to the United States. American automakers, including GM, rely on Canadian suppliers for everything from aluminum castings to electronic control modules. If Canada restricts or taxes the export of these components, American plants face supply disruptions and cost increases. Joly has quietly signaled to Canadian auto parts manufacturers that the government will support them in reducing their dependency on American customers and pivoting to Asian and European markets instead. This is economic judo. You don't meet force with force. You redirect your opponent's momentum and let them fall. If GM wants to move production to Indiana, fine, but they'll find that the Canadian suppliers they relied on are no longer interested in serving them. Those suppliers are now focused on Honda, Toyota, Hyundai, and emerging Chinese EV manufacturers who are looking to enter the Canadian market. And this brings us to the final piece of the puzzle: critical minerals. Canada holds massive reserves of lithium, cobalt, nickel, graphite, and rare earth elements, the essential ingredients for electric vehicle batteries and advanced electronics. These are the resources that will define the 21st century economy, just as oil defined the 20th. For years, Canadian policymakers assumed that these minerals would naturally flow south to American battery manufacturers. But Joly is now implementing policies that require companies extracting these minerals to process them domestically or export them to partners who have invested in Canadian manufacturing. In December 2025, Canada signed a Memorandum of Understanding with South Korea, LG Energy Solution, to build a battery processing facility in Ontario. The facility will source lithium from Canadian mines and produce battery cells for Hyundai and Kia vehicles manufactured in Canada. Notice who's not part of that deal: General Motors. Joly is creating an ecosystem where access to Canadian resources is contingent on long-term commitment to Canadian jobs. If you want our lithium, you need to build your batteries here. If you want our nickel, you need to employ our workers. This is the new playbook, and it's working. In late January 2026, Volkswagen and a Chinese EV manufacturer both announced they are exploring the possibility of establishing assembly plants in Canada, attracted by the combination of government subsidies, access to critical minerals, and proximity to the North American market. GM, meanwhile, is being systematically frozen out. Now, some of you might be thinking, isn't this protectionism? Isn't Canada just doing the same thing Trump is doing with his tariffs? Yes and no. Trump's tariffs are blunt instruments designed to force reshoring through brute economic pressure. They punish allies and adversaries alike, disrupt supply chains, and create uncertainty that makes long-term planning impossible. Canada's approach is different. It's not about punishing trade. It's about rewarding reliability and penalizing betrayal. Companies that honor their commitments get preferential access to Canadian markets, resources, and subsidies. Companies that take the money and run face financial clawbacks and regulatory barriers. This is the difference between nationalism and accountability. And the results are already visible. Oshawa, the city that just lost 200 GM jobs, has an unemployment rate of 8.6%, the second highest in Canada. Windsor, another automotive city hit by the trade war, has the highest unemployment rate at 9%. But here's what the data also shows. While the Detroit Three have been shedding jobs, employment at Japanese-owned automotive plants in Canada has remained stable. In 2024, jobs with Japanese car makers accounted for just over 60% of all auto assembly employment in Canada, up from 40% in 2015. The pain is real. The workers who lost their jobs are not abstractions in a geopolitical chess game. There are people with mortgages, families, and futures that have been upended. But the strategic pivot is also real. Canada is no longer waiting for American corporations to decide our economic fate. We are building alliances with partners who respect us as equals, not dependent. Joly summarized the new reality in a statement to the press on February 3, 2026. For too long, we have operated under the assumption that loyalty to our southern neighbor would be rewarded with reciprocal loyalty. The actions of companies like General Motors have proven that assumption false. We are not closing the door to American investment, but we are opening the door wider to partners who value long-term collaboration over short-term opportunism. And we are making it clear that Canadian workers, Canadian resources, and Canadian taxpayer dollars come with expectations. If you don't meet those expectations, there will be consequences. That final sentence is the key. Consequences. For decades, Canada absorbed broken promises, factory closures, and economic subordination without meaningful retaliation. We were the polite neighbor who didn't make a fuss when American corporations took advantage of us. That era is over. General Motors thought they could take $500 million in Canadian subsidies, lay off over 2,000 Canadian workers, and face no consequences. They thought Canada would shrug and move on. They were wrong. And every other corporation watching this drama unfold is now recalculating because the message from Ottawa is clear. Betray Canada, and we will make you pay. The Oshawa layoffs are a tragedy for the workers and families affected. But they are also a turning point. They mark the moment when Canada stopped being a passive participant in North American economic integration and started dictating terms. The ghost of the branch plant economy is dying. And in its place, a more assertive, more independent Canada is being born. One that doesn't beg. One that doesn't bend. One that remembers who stood with us and who stabbed us in the back. General Motors will remember January 30th, 2026 as the day they saved a few $1 million by moving jobs to Indiana. But history will remember it as the day Canada stopped playing by America's rules. If you found this analysis valuable, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. This fight for economic sovereignty isn't fought with tariffs alone. It's fought with information, awareness, and the willingness to call out betrayal when we see it. Thank you for watching, and welcome to the new.